The neighborhood was designed to look perfect, or at least that was the goal the HOA kept trying to enforce. Every driveway was supposed to be spotless, every mailbox freshly painted, every lawn trimmed with machine-like precision. It wasn't the sort of place where individuality thrived. No bold house colors, no unusual decorations, no visible trash cans, and especially no signs of unsanctioned fun that could interrupt the perfectly curated suburban silence. The families who lived there had grown used to it. Most were too busy with work, commuting, or the daily routines of life to question the rules. They tolerated the monthly HOA newsletters and shrugged off the occasional compliance reminders that appeared taped to doors. The system ran like a machine because people rarely pushed back. It was easier to obey than resist. That changed the day a basketball hoop went up at the end of one driveway. It wasn't anything extravagant. Just a standard portable hoop, weighted at the base with sandbags, placed so a teenager could shoot hoops after school. The sound of the ball bouncing on the pavement, the rhythmic thunk-thunk against the ground, echoed through the cul-de-sac in the afternoons. Sometimes friends would join in. A few neighbors even smiled at the sound, recognizing it as the harmless noise of kids being active, kids enjoying themselves outside in an era where so many were glued to screens. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore. The first letter came quickly. It was printed on stiff paper with the association's letterhead at the top, worded in cold, clinical language. Unapproved recreational equipment in public view. Violation of Section 14B. Immediate removal required. The letter ended with the usual thinly veiled threat. Non-compliance would result in daily fines. For most homeowners, that would have been the end of it. They would have sighed, wheeled the hoop into a garage, and let it collect dust. But this homeowner was different. He didn't take kindly to being told what his family could and could not enjoy on their own property. The hoop had cost money, his kids loved it, and it wasn't hurting anyone. So, he left it up. That's when the escalation began. The HOA didn't waste time. They issued another letter, this one stamped second notice. The fines started adding up. $50 for the first day, $100 for the next, then a rolling charge until compliance was achieved. Neighbors whispered about it, some nervously, some with quiet admiration. Everyone had seen battles with the HOA before, but few had watched someone stand their ground so firmly. The board members themselves were relentless. They drove by more frequently, slowing down in their SUVs, glaring from behind tinted windows. They snapped photos as if gathering evidence for a trial. To them, it wasn't about a basketball hoop anymore. It was about control. If one homeowner refused to bend, it set a dangerous precedent. By the third week, the fines had ballooned into the thousands. A formal hearing notice was taped to the door, summoning him to a meeting where the board intended to shame him into submission. But instead of panicking, he stayed calm. He paid no attention to their intimidation tactics. In fact, the more they pushed, the more he thought about just how absurd it was to live in a place where a child couldn't shoot baskets in his own driveway. That's when the idea took hold. If they thought a single hoop was unacceptable, then maybe the only proper response was to take it further. Not to hide the hoop, not to quietly comply, but to make a statement so bold, so defiant, that the HOA would regret ever starting the fight. The thought started small at first. What if instead of removing the hoop he anchored it permanently, poured a proper slab, maybe even painted court lines? But as the days passed, the idea grew bigger, louder, more outrageous. What if he went beyond a driveway hoop altogether? What if he built something so massive that the HOA couldn't ignore it, but also couldn't stop it without looking ridiculous? The plan crystallized. He would turn his entire backyard into a full-scale basketball court. The timing worked in his favor. His yard was deep, one of the larger lots in the subdivision, sloping slightly toward the back, where nothing but grass had sat unused for years. The HOA had never shown much interest in what happened behind the fences, so long as the front-facing image of perfection was maintained. Technically, there was nothing in the bylaws forbidding a backyard sports court, especially if it wasn't visible from the street. So while the HOA obsessed over the single hoop in the driveway, preparations quietly began in the back. Contractors were called. Concrete was poured in the early mornings, trucks rolling in before most neighbors were awake. By the time curious eyes peeked out, large sections of the backyard were already being transformed. Rebar, gravel, cement mixers, all the signs of a major project, appeared almost overnight. To outsiders, it might have looked like a patio extension or a landscaping overhaul, but the homeowner knew exactly what was being built. A regulation-sized basketball court, complete with painted lines, 2 anchored hoops, fencing to catch stray balls, and even night lighting. The sound of construction attracted attention. The HOA board drove by more often, suspicious of what was happening, but they were fixated on the visible violation, the single hoop still standing defiantly in the driveway. Their letters grew increasingly aggressive, threatening liens, legal action, and court dates. All the while, they remained unaware of the much larger rebellion taking shape just beyond the fences. When the court was finally finished, it was more impressive than anyone had imagined. A full half-acre of polished concrete stretched across the backyard, marked with bright white paint that gleamed in the sun. The 2 professional-grade hoops towered proudly at each end, backboards glittering. At night, floodlights cast the space in a golden glow, making it playable even after dark. It wasn't just a court, it was a statement, a monument to resistance against the absurdity of HOA control. The first game was played quietly, with family and a few close friends. Sneakers squeaked against the concrete, the ball arced through the air, and the satisfying swish of net on basket carried across the neighborhood. Children's laughter echoed. The joy was undeniable, and just as he had predicted, the HOA's reaction was immediate. They lost their minds. The board called emergency meetings. Letters arrived daily now, each more frantic than the last. They demanded the immediate removal of the unapproved structure. They claimed it was lowering property values, creating noise disturbances, and violating unspecified community standards. The more they panicked, the more obvious it became that they were out of their depth. The bylaws they leaned on so heavily didn't actually prohibit private recreational courts. Their authority for once had limits, and the homeowner knew it. He framed their letters in his garage like trophies. He laughed as they sputtered and flailed, their own rules collapsing under the weight of his defiance. Neighbors, once fearful, began stopping by to compliment the court, some asking if their kids could come shoot hoops. The backyard that had once been just grass was now alive with energy and community. It was no longer just an act of rebellion, it was becoming a gathering place. But this was only the beginning, because as the HOA tried harder and harder to clamp down, the homeowner realized he had tapped into something far bigger than just a fight over a basketball hoop. He had exposed the pettiness of the system. He had given the neighborhood a reason to rally together, and the more the board fought him, the more powerful his position became. The stage was set for the showdown that would come next. A war was brewing, not just over a driveway hoop, but over freedom, community, and the right to enjoy one's own home without interference. And while the HOA scrambled in panic, the backyard court stood tall, gleaming under the lights, ready to host not just games but a revolution. The weeks following the completion of the backyard basketball court were some of the most chaotic the neighborhood had ever seen. Word spread quickly that something unprecedented had been built just beyond the fences. What had once been idle gossip about fines and violations now became an open conversation in driveways, at mailboxes, and in the quiet moments when neighbors leaned over fences to whisper about what they'd heard. The basketball court wasn't just a project. It was a spectacle, and the HOA knew it. The board members were livid. They had poured countless hours into letters, citations, and fines over a single driveway hoop, only to watch the homeowner respond by building something 10 times larger. To them, it wasn't only a personal insult, it was a direct challenge to their authority. And if there was one thing an HOA hated, it was losing control. Their response was immediate and aggressive. Another thick envelope arrived, this time packed with formal citations stacked together like ammunition. They accused the homeowner of constructing an unapproved structure without proper permits. They cited noise complaints, even though most of them were fabricated. They even claimed that the floodlights installed for night games constituted a public nuisance. But the board's fury only revealed their weakness. The bylaws they wielded so confidently in other disputes were vague at best when it came to private backyard projects. There was no rule against basketball courts, no clause banning recreational slabs. The only argument they had left was the subjective claim that the court violated community aesthetics. But aesthetics were hard to enforce when the structure couldn't even be seen from the street. The homeowner knew this, and more importantly, so did the neighbors. In the beginning, people had been hesitant. They'd watched from a distance, worried about being caught in the crossfire between one stubborn resident and an HOA determined to crush him. But as the board's tactics grew more hostile, sympathy began to shift. People recognized the absurdity of the fight. They saw how the board was wasting time and resources chasing after something that didn't actually hurt anyone. And slowly, they started showing up. It began with small visits. A few kids from down the street asked if they could shoot hoops after school. Parents, wary at first, began accompanying them. Soon, entire families started showing up in the evenings, curious to see the court they'd heard so much about. The homeowner didn't turn anyone away. He welcomed them, and with every new family that stepped onto the concrete, the backyard began transforming into more than just a personal project. It became a community gathering space. The sound of bouncing basketballs filled the air almost every day now. Sneakers squeaked, laughter echoed, and the metallic clank of missed shots carried into the night. On weekends, impromptu games broke out, with teams forming from whoever showed up. Teenagers played alongside adults, younger kids chased stray balls, and parents stood chatting at the sidelines. What had begun as an act of defiance was rapidly turning into the heart of the neighborhood. This only enraged the HOA further. Board members started driving by at odd hours, slowing their cars near the property to glare through the fence slats. They snapped photos of children playing, claiming it was evidence of unauthorized gatherings. They even filed police reports, though the officers who showed up quickly realized it was nothing more than kids playing basketball in a private yard. Each attempt to shut things down backfired, only fueling more resentment toward the board. The HOA then tried a new tactic. They mailed out letters to the entire community, warning residents that participation in unsanctioned recreational activities on private property could result in fines or penalties. But this move crossed a line. For the first time, the broader neighborhood felt directly threatened. People who had never spoken out against the HOA before suddenly found themselves angry, realizing that the board was trying to police where their children could play and where families could spend their time. The shift was palpable. Conversations that once ended in nervous silence now carried an edge of defiance. Neighbors who had quietly tolerated the HOA's rules for years began openly criticizing the board. The basketball court wasn't just a personal project anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance. Sensing the momentum, the homeowner leaned into it. He invested further in the space, adding benches along the edges for parents to sit and watch. A small scoreboard was mounted, turning casual games into something more official. Even a portable speaker system was installed, filling the evenings with music as games went on. What the HOA had condemned as a nuisance was blossoming into a community hub, unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. But the board wasn't done fighting. Desperation led them to escalate legally. They attempted to file for an injunction demanding the immediate removal of the court. Their argument leaned heavily on aesthetic disruption and community standards, though both claims were flimsy. When the case made its way before a local judge, the board's representatives stumbled over their reasoning. The homeowner's lawyer pointed out that nothing in the bylaws prohibited the court, and that personal enjoyment of property was well within the rights of the homeowner. The judge dismissed the motion. It was a humiliating blow for the HOA. Months of fines, threats, and posturing had amounted to nothing, and worse, their failed attempt only emboldened the community further. Neighbors who had once hesitated now began openly defying the board in small ways, leaving their trash cans visible, planting unapproved flowers, or letting their kids ride bikes in the street without fear of letters. The aura of control the HOA had cultivated for years was unraveling. Meanwhile, the basketball court was thriving. Summer rolled in, and with it came longer days and warmer nights. The court became a nightly tradition, with pickup games stretching into the evening under the glow of the floodlights. Parents brought coolers of drinks, kids organized tournaments, and laughter spilled across the fences. The backyard, once just grass, had transformed into the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Even those who hadn't supported the project at first began to warm to it. They couldn't deny the joy it brought. For the first time in years, neighbors were truly connecting. Friendships formed, kids who barely knew each other became teammates, and a sense of community that had been missing for so long returned stronger than ever. But the HOA wasn't ready to give up. When their legal efforts failed, they turned inward, plotting new ways to reclaim authority. Secret meetings were held in board members' living rooms, whispered conversations carried late into the night. They began talking about rewriting bylaws, pushing for amendments that would explicitly ban private recreational courts. They hoped that by changing the rules, they could retroactively outlaw what had already been built. Word of this spread quickly, though, as neighbors who attended those meetings began leaking details. The scheme only deepened the divide. Many residents saw it as proof that the board was more interested in control than community. Others realized that the HOA's actions were costing them money, with legal fees and administrative costs draining association funds. The rebellion grew. By the end of the summer, attendance at the basketball court wasn't just a handful of families, it was dozens. What had started as a fight over a single hoop had spiraled into a movement that united the entire block, and the more the HOA resisted, the more powerless they looked. The tension was undeniable now. The board was cornered, the community was energized, and the court had become something no one could ignore. The battle lines were clear. On one side stood the HOA, clinging desperately to its crumbling authority. On the other stood the homeowner and his neighbors, united by the belief that their neighborhood belonged to the people who lived in it, not the petty rules of a power-hungry board. And as autumn approached, it was obvious that the final showdown was coming. The HOA wasn't finished, but neither was the community. The basketball court had survived fines, threats, and lawsuits, but the biggest battle was still on the horizon, because the board wasn't planning to let it end quietly. As autumn settled in, the crisp air carried with it both anticipation and tension. The leaves along the neighborhood streets turned shades of gold and crimson, but beneath the beauty of the season, the community was bracing for what everyone knew was coming. The HOA had gone quiet, too quiet. After months of harassment, fines, threats, and even a failed lawsuit, the sudden silence from the board wasn't a sign of surrender. It was a warning. They were regrouping, waiting for their moment to strike. The basketball court continued to thrive in the meantime. Every evening, the sound of bouncing balls and laughter echoed across the fences. Even as the temperatures dropped, families bundled in sweaters and jackets still showed up to play or to watch. The floodlights cut through the early darkness, illuminating faces that smiled despite the cold. The court had become more than just a slab of concrete with hoops. It was a sanctuary. For many residents, it symbolized freedom. For others, it was proof that the HOA wasn't untouchable. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood from years of unnecessary control. The board's attempts to crush one man's project had backfired spectacularly, and now the balance of power was shifting. But the HOA wasn't finished. One brisk October morning, another envelope landed in the homeowner's mailbox. Unlike the others, this wasn't a simple fine or citation. It was a notice of a special emergency meeting called by the HOA board. The letter outlined a proposed amendment to the bylaws, an amendment that would ban private recreational structures, including sports courts, retroactively. If passed, it would force the removal of the basketball court, regardless of when it had been built. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered in driveways, parents exchanged worried glances at the sidelines, and kids who had come to love the court asked if it was really going to be torn down. The board's move was bold, but it was also desperate. They weren't trying to enforce the rules anymore. They were trying to change them to erase what they couldn't control. When the night of the meeting arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The HOA clubhouse, usually half empty during board sessions, was packed wall to wall. Residents who rarely bothered to attend showed up in droves, determined to make their voices heard. The board members sat at the front, stiff and scowling, their papers stacked neatly in front of them like weapons. The presentation began with predictable language. The board claimed the court posed a safety hazard, that it caused noise, that it disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. They insisted that allowing it to remain would set a dangerous precedent. Their speeches droned on, filled with vague warnings and exaggerated claims. But as they spoke, the tension in the room shifted. The neighbors weren't buying it. One by one, residents began standing up. Some spoke of how their children had made friends they never would have met otherwise. Others described how the court had brought the community together in a way nothing else had. Parents pointed out that their kids were spending more time outside, exercising and bonding, instead of glued to screens indoors. Retirees mentioned how they'd come to enjoy sitting on the benches, watching games unfold like neighborhood theater. The board tried to interrupt, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The room wasn't theirs anymore, it belonged to the people. By the time the vote was called, it was clear the amendment didn't stand a chance. The board had expected fear to carry the day, but instead, unity prevailed. Residents overwhelmingly rejected the bylaw change, leaving the board humiliated once again. The attempt to seize back control had only further exposed their weakness. But the story didn't end there. The failed amendment was the breaking point. The HOA had poured money into legal fees, wasted time on failed strategies, and alienated the very people they were supposed to serve. Whispers of a recall began circulating. People who had once tolerated the board's overreach now openly questioned whether they should even remain in charge. Petitions started quietly passing from household to household, gathering signatures in secret. Within weeks, the movement was unstoppable. At the next monthly meeting, a petition for a full board recall was submitted. The signatures exceeded the threshold required by the bylaws, and a special election was set. The board members tried everything to cling to power. They begged, they threatened, they warned of chaos if they were removed. But their words fell flat. Residents remembered every fine, every letter, every petty threat. They remembered how the board had tried to destroy something that had brought joy to the community. And they were ready for change. When the votes were finally counted, the result was decisive. The board was ousted. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free of its heavy-handed leadership. A new board was elected, one made up of residents who had stood shoulder to shoulder at the basketball court, cheering for their kids, sharing drinks, and laughing together. People who understood that the neighborhood wasn't about control, but about community. With the new board came a wave of changes. Outdated rules were rewritten, petty restrictions were scrapped, and residents were given a stronger voice in decisions. Transparency replaced secrecy, cooperation replaced threats, and for the first time in a long time, people felt proud to live where they did. The basketball court became the centerpiece of this new era. What had begun as one man's act of defiance was now officially recognized as a community resource. Events were organized around it, family tournaments, holiday gatherings, even charity fundraisers where local businesses donated prizes. The court was no longer just a backyard feature. It was the beating heart of the neighborhood. Over time, the homeowner expanded it even further. A half-court addition allowed for larger games. A small playground was installed nearby for younger kids. Shade structures and picnic tables were added, turning the space into a full-fledged community park. What had started as a battle over a single basketball hoop had blossomed into something no one could have imagined, a sports complex that united the neighborhood. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very thing the HOA had fought to destroy had instead become the most beloved feature of the community. The board's stubbornness had sparked a rebellion, and their defeat had paved the way for something better. What they had seen as a violation of the rules had instead become a symbol of freedom, resilience, and togetherness. As seasons passed, the court remained busy year-round. Kids grew up on it, friendships flourished, and memories were made under the bright floodlights. Even those who had once grumbled about the noise eventually came to appreciate the joy it brought. The court wasn't just concrete and hoops anymore. It was history written in sweat, laughter, and the echoes of bouncing basketballs. The homeowner often stood at the edge of the court, watching it all unfold. What had started as frustration and defiance had transformed into something far greater than he'd ever planned. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about community. It was about proving that when people stood together, even the most controlling forces could be overcome. The HOA had tried to take away a simple basketball hoop. In the end, they lost everything, and the neighborhood gained something far more valuable in return. The final whistle had blown, the game was over, and the people had won.